Hi guys, I keep saying listen to the experts and not the politicians. So who better on issues of finance than the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies? So they have a regular podcast, which I'll leave a link to in the description of this video, where they cover a whole range of economic topics. But I want to share with you this clip from their latest, which covers the issue of austerity. Now, Labour have said that they won't return to the cost-cutting ideology which the Tories ran with when they took power over a decade ago. But how can we measure what is austerity and that Rachel Reeves, the chancellor, is avoiding it? Here economist Ben Zaranko gave his take on what austerity would look like.
If we're thinking about austerity for public services, then you can make an argument that big whacking great tax rises are a form of austerity, but let's just focus on public services for now.
Fair point.
I think it's useful to think in percentages, because when you start looking at pounds billion, you can get thrown off by the Treasury are prone to doing big changes and statistical classification changes that really make our lives very difficult. So thank you in advance for that. But if you think about percentages, so at the moment, public service spending is set to grow by 1% per year. I think that if you are looking at, broadly speaking, how much would that have to increase to deliver all promises on things like the NHS and on defence and on all the other things without cutting stuff? It probably needs to go to more like 2%. And if you want to get into a world where you're actually delivering meaningful increases more or less across the board, it probably needs to be closer to 3%. And just some context, Rishi Sunak aimed for 3.3% last spending review in the 2000s when everything was going gangbusters, to quote a former prime minister. It was going up more like 6 or 7%. So 3% isn't by any means like mega generous by historic standards, but it would probably be enough to at least improve some public services or provide the funding available to at least give them a realistic shot of that. The big thing here, really, if you're looking at public services, it's hard to avoid the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is called the NHS, because the NHS is so big that what you do there more or less dominates what you do on anything else. And I think that if you look at opinion polls and you look at sort of some of the analysis coming out from political commentators, the Labour Party probably know that their re-election chances will hinge in large part on whether they've managed to turn the NHS around. So I would be stunned if the NHS isn't prioritised, but the degree to which it's prioritised will matter a lot for things like courts, prisons, local government, because if there's a mega NHS settlement, then there's just not going to be much left for anything else.
And this is one of the great challenges that faces all governments now, that small changes in the rate of increase in NHS spending has huge effects on everything else, because you say NHS spending is more than 40% of all public service spending now, which is just astonishing. So you change that a little bit and you make a big difference to what's available elsewhere. But I think what Ben said is really worth looking out for in terms of scale. So Jeremy Hunt said he would increase public service spending by 1% a year. And because of commitments to the NHS and defence and so on, that would have meant cuts in a whole range of public services. You move to 2% a year, which sounds quite generous, and that's just about enough to keep everything outside the NHS and so on pretty much constant in real terms over a period of time. So no cuts, but still shrinking as a fraction of the economy, and no more resource than they've got now. You really have to be up around 3%, where you're keeping spending constant as a fraction of national income on a lot of these so-called unprotected areas, and you've perhaps got some shot at additional resources to make a difference. But even that...
So, yes. So what we're talking about here is if public spending in different departments increases by just 1%, we're talking about austerity, because it's not keeping in line with prices. If we're talking about 2%, it's breaking even. It means, okay, we're not going backwards, but we're not really going forwards. We're staying steady. And it would require 3% to see a real shift away from austerity, a real shift in funding public services to a level that they can operate. They can operate to a level where the public can see some sort of improvement. Now, of course, ideally it would be much more than 3%, but as was pointed out here, the NHS, which takes up about 40% of the public sector budget, it needs to be prioritised. But if you prioritise it, you're going to have to cut something elsewhere. And maybe this is what we're going to see. We're going to see the NHS prioritised, more funding for the NHS, because Labour know that they need to fund the NHS. If they don't, they're going to be out on their ear. But at the same time, they're going to have to take money from other departments. So it's likely what we're going to see when the budget eventually comes round, it won't be sold as an austerity budget. Can we define it as an austerity budget? Well, perhaps, but not for the NHS. So some departments will not be exposed to austerity, but some will. And on the balance, we'll have to see if general increases in spending is above 2%. If it's not, then we're in a situation where the chancellor is going down the road of austerity. So it's great to hear from the experts. They know what they're talking about. I don't. That's why I rely on them. But we can see this sort of barometer appearing. 1% austerity, 2% maintaining a balance, and then 3% would be, of course, the right direction to be going in, where public services are funded to a level where the public can see some sort of benefit taking place. They can see them increasing to a level where they see a real difference. And if Labour want to stay in power, they need to be heading in the direction of 3%. But once again, if you're not going to increase taxes, if you're not going to borrow, then that's going to be a difficult task to achieve. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.